Good afternoon. Welcome to the Nebraska State Historical Society, the Museum of Nebraska History. My name is Brent Carmack. I am the Associate Director for Museum and Historic Sites. I want to welcome all of you to the April Brown Bag History Forum. Before we get started, I want to make mention that funding to pay for the taping of these programs, the show on 5 City TV, has been generously provided by the Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation, and for that we're very grateful. Today's speaker is Stephanie Grace Whitson. She is a Nebraska author of historical fiction. She's got 10 books out in print, with one coming out in August. Her latest series is set in Fort Robinson, so for those of you who are familiar with the state and with the Historical Society, that'll be exciting to check out. Stephanie grew up in southern Illinois, but has been in Nebraska since 1975. Did you say? Great. She is the lead curator for the exhibit Patchwork Lives that's on display on the third floor of the Museum of Nebraska History and will be on display for 2 more years. She developed an interest in American quilts and women's history that has really informed her writing and her avocations, and that has led her to volunteer at the International Quilt Studies Center and is how we got to this place today. So, without further ado, Stephanie Grace Whitson.
Thank you for coming. I don't usually speak in academic settings, and I've thought that I owe Brent and Deb and Carolyn and everybody else who's helped me with this project a thank you. I've had to learn a whole new vocabulary. I've learned that you don't do talks, you do lectures, and you don't handle stuff, you mount artifacts. And this isn't a dress, it's a garment, and all kinds of things. So they've been patient with me as I've learned a new vocabulary to work more in an academic setting. I am a storyteller. I'm not a literature writer. I'm a storyteller. And so this talk this morning, today, is going to be based on some stories that I've gleaned from true Nebraska history. People often ask me in my books, well, where does what really happened leave off and what you make up begin? And the funny thing about history is that what really happened is much more interesting and much more fascinating than anything that I could ever make up. So the events in my books are true, but the people who live them are complete creations of my very overactive imagination. That's a requirement for being a fiction writer. You have to have an overactive imagination. I'm going to start by reading a poem to you called The Patchwork Quilt. It was sheet music at the turn of the century, and we actually have a piece of it reproduced upstairs in the show, so you'll get to see it. But this is how the words go. Did Grandma ever tell you about the patchwork quilt that lies across the sofa in her room? It is made from scraps of dresses that she wore when she was young, and some of them were woven on a loom. Sometimes when it's raining and I can't play out of doors, she lets me spread it out upon the floor. And as I choose the pieces that I'd like to hear about, she tells me of the dresses that she wore. It isn't just the dresses that Grandma tells about, it's the things that happened when she had them on. And almost every piece that's in that patchwork quilt holds the memory of a sorrow or a song. Things were very wonderful when Grandmama was young. You ought to hear her tell about it all. The men were also, the ladies all were beautiful, the children all were good, and the men were all so gallant and so tall. She calls the quilt her memory bed, and every little piece is a flower blooming in the scented fold. There are red ones for roses and blues for don't forgets and yellow ones for sunflowers of gold. There's one she calls sweet lavender that smells like baby clothes, and one of purple like the sunset skies. I never ask about those, or the gray one like the rain, for if I do, dear Grandma always cries. My grandma told me once that life is just a patchwork quilt of births and deaths and marriages and things, and sometimes when you're looking for a lovely piece of red, you only find a knot of faded strings. But she says the red is redder when it's by a piece of brown, and gray is not so gray by sunny gold. Oh, I hope I'll have a lovely patchwork quilt like Grandma's to show to little children when I'm old. I think we can all relate to that. If we're quilt lovers, we all relate to the stories behind the quilts. And that's what has drawn me to my love for the American quilt. It's not the artifact. It's that it's a representation of a woman's life. And one of the things that we tried to do upstairs was to put the quilts in the context of a woman's life. Now, I'm a storyteller, so I have the fun that if I don't really know, I get to just make it up. So today I'm going to just make up a few things and tell you some things I know about some of these pieces that belong to me. I really don't know what it is about quilts that draw people, but as we can see today, it's not Stephanie Grace Whitson who drew this crowd today. It's the fact that you have quilts to look at. And everybody loves American quilts. I have a friend who's a teacher, and she travels, and she tells the story of sitting next to a gentleman on a plane one time and telling him what she did for a living. And he said that he had a quilt rack in his living room in his apartment, and she said, well, what quilts are on it? Well, he didn't have any quilts yet, but he liked them, and he was going to get some. I always am amused when I travel, if I have a piece of handwork in my hands, that people kind of assume that if you're a quilter, you're a nice person. And they'll come over and sit down and strike up conversations, and I hear wonderful stories when I travel because I carry working on patchwork with me. Now, some people will look at a quilt and all they see is a bed cover. I was working on a quilt when I was a teenager for a best friend of mine, and another girl who was also a best friend of mine said, what are you doing? And I explained to her that I was making this quilt for a future wedding day. And her comment was, well, wouldn't it be a lot easier to just go over to the department store and buy a blanket? I did not make that friend a quilt when she got married. Some people just see bed coverings. Some people look at them and they see patience. If you're a quilt maker here today, you have had people say to you, oh, I would never have the patience to do that. I don't know how you stand to do that. Well, of course, what they don't understand is for those of us who are quilt makers, it doesn't take any patience because we love what we're doing. Other people look at quilts and they see art. And we have just had a wonderful art exhibit of quilts at the Sheridan Gallery on the campus at UNL. And we have more art hanging at the Lent Center often. So there's been a whole new resurgence of appreciation for the artistic nature. I was talking to someone earlier today, and she said that what amazed her was quilt makers today, we have so many wonderful tools in front of us. There's a tool called a ruby beholder that helps you look through it and you can tell the value of the fabric, so you know you're really using a light and you're really using a dark. And we look back at the quilts that were made 100 years ago before such things existed and sometimes are astonished at how did that woman know that those colors would work. I would never put orange and red together in a quilt, but she did, and it looks wonderful. So I've gotten a great admiration for the artistic ability of our foremothers and the quilt makers who've gone before. For me, I see the women and I see the lives that are represented in the quilts, and that's what draws me to quilts. There's a very amusing book called Aunt Jane of Kentucky that is a folklore book and has recently been reprinted, and Aunt Jane is a prolific quilt maker. And she says this about her quilts. Some folks has albums to put folks' pictures in to remember and buy, and some folks has a book and writes down the things that happen every day so they won't forget them. But honey, these quilts is my albums and my diaries, and whenever the weather's bad and I can't get out to see folks, I just spread out my quilts and look at them and study over them, and it's just like going back and living my life all over again. Patchwork? No. It's memory, imagination, history, biography, joy, sorrow, philosophy, religion, romance, realism, life, love, and death. And overall, like a halo, the love of the artist for his work and the soul's longing for earthly immortality. And I really relate to what Aunt Jane said about quilt making, and I bet a lot of you here today can relate to that too. I look at these things and I wonder, did she come west in a wagon? Was she lonely when she was working on that? Were there kids playing under her quilting frame when she stitched it? Did she hear a really juicy piece of gossip while she was working on that block? The questions that I ask about quilts actually began for me with a bunch of quilt pieces. And my house is furnished, I hope there's somebody else here like this. My house is furnished in what we call early auction and old barn. Because when I grew up, if you needed a piece of furniture, you went to the farm auction. You didn't go to the furniture store. And I grew up going to auctions. And so when I moved to Nebraska, I needed furniture, and so I went to auctions. And I stood in the July Nebraska sun one day waiting for the last box of rags to sell at a sale, because at the bottom of the box of rags were these. And I knew that they were unfinished quilt pieces, and I was very drawn to the browns, and I hadn't studied anything about old quilts before, but I was drawn to these. Not long after I bought these pieces at that auction, I went to a class being taught by a textile historian named Barbara Brackman. And Mrs. Brackman looked at those pieces, and I told her where I got them, and she said, they didn't come from Nebraska. And I said, well, how can you possibly know that? And she said, well, because that fabric is probably from about 20 years before Nebraska became a state. There weren't any white women making quilts in Nebraska when that fabric was printed. That kind of got my imagination going. How did they get here? Why didn't they ever get finished? Diamond pieces are very difficult to piece and make lay flat. If you put this together on the floor, it lays beautifully. The darks and lights make the star move just like they're supposed to. And so I wondered about those pieces, and I left those questions unanswered. But that was part of my journey into the quilting world and learning more about the women who made them. I don't have very many family quilts. I have one, and this is it. And if you saw this at a garage sale or an auction, you wouldn't want it. But this represents quite a family story. These are dress scraps from a German woman named Barbara Johanna Heinecke, who had a baby in about 1920, and Barbara Johanna died when that baby was an infant. And the father of family didn't feel like he wanted to raise a baby, and so he gave the baby up for adoption. When that little girl grew up, she found that she was adopted because it was listed on her birth certificate, which she needed when she got married. She not only learned that she was adopted, she learned that she had a sister and a brother somewhere in the world. And so her name was Louise, and Louise started looking for her family. Unbeknownst to Louise, her big sister had been looking for her ever since she grew up. Louise's sister's name was Nora, and they did finally find each other. I have a wonderful picture at home from a newspaper from World War II where my mother, whose name was Nora, was reunited with her baby sister Louise, who had been given away for adoption when she was a little girl. My mother from her childhood had this baby quilt and a spoon. That was her mother's, and that's all she had left from her family growing up. So we look at this and see a rag that really doesn't have any monetary value. It's only machine quilted, and we'll talk more about that later. But to me, it's a treasure because of the women it represents. So that's one thing that we can think about when we look at quilts and quilt pieces, is the women that they represent. Another thing that I've come to admire about the women who've gone before us because of the quilts that I've studied is the frugality. We all have those wonderful stories of moving Grandma into the nursing home, and she had 135 butter tubs carefully washed and put away with lids. My mother-in-law did that, and we teased her mercilessly, and she had a great sense of humor. And she said, well, I just might need them, I just might need them. But we do see frugality in our quilts too, as far as the small pieces of fabric that women used. There's a quilt upstairs in the exhibit right now that's called a postage stamp, and it was pieced and quilted by hand, but the binding is on by machine. And I could make up a great story about that, but we don't have time for that right now. I won't ask for a show of hands, but there's a publication now called the Tightwad Gazette. If anybody here subscribes to that, but that's nothing new. In the 1830s, there was a publication called The American Frugal Housewife, and this is the advice it gave. The true economy of housekeeping is simply the art of gathering up all the fragments so that nothing be lost. I mean the fragments of time as well as materials. Nothing should be thrown away so long as it is possible to make any use of it, however trifling that use may be. Now I have to confess, I will probably have to spend time in Quilter's Purgatory because of the pieces of fabric I have thrown away. Because I throw away fabric pieces that really could be used to make quilts if I would only take the time to do it. This is one of the ladies who will visit me in Quilt Purgatory because she saved them all. Those little triangles are less than an inch, but look what she made, a beautiful little throw, probably a crib quilt, who knows. But she believed in using tiny pieces. So did the lady who made the middle of this believe in using tiny pieces. And I'll tell you the story I made up about this one in a minute after I get it open. See the middle? Now what's great about this to me is this woman was saving tiny pieces of fabric, but she also had a plan. Look at how that middle is pieced. There's double pink down the middle and the reds are on the edges. So she had a design in mind, even though she was using these little tiny pieces. Now, as a storyteller, I bought this going, I want to know the story. And my story is the same woman didn't make the edges who made the middle. I think probably she had Grandma's project in a drawer, and it got to be cold, and she needed a blanket. And so she got Grandma's project and put some borders on it. And it used to be a tied comforter. If you hold it up to the light, you can see the holes from where it was tied. So I think she made it. I am a kindred spirit with the woman who made the borders. Of course, we're all familiar, if we love quilts, with our 20th century version of frugality, the feed sack. This one is from Gooch's Mill. So I bought it from an antique dealer, and I heard a lady walk by and go, "The day I pay $8 for one of those nasty old feed sacks." So it depends on what color your hair is, I guess, if you think this is cool or not. But everybody and their mother has a grandmother's flower garden quilt, just about. I think it must have been a requirement. If you were a bride in the 1930s, you had to make either a double wedding ring, a grandmother's flower garden, or a around-the-world quilt. But I have one that wasn't those, and I have had it looked at by feed sack collectors, and they tell me that yes, there are some feed sacks in here, and I just love what this lady did with just a little simple 9-patch. Isn't that beautiful? So she made something really beautiful out of her feed sacks. My favorite quilt that I own that shows frugality, something just dropped. Did anything go off? I guarantee you, my middle name is Grace, and I live up to it. I'll probably trip over these cords before it's over. Is this piece, which is from North Carolina, and these are probably dress scraps. I won't even begin in this august society to tell you how old I think this is, because there's somebody here who could tell you much better than I. But the reason I acquired this was not because of this front, although this is the quilt I was thinking of when I told you I would never think to put orange and gold together in a quilt, and yet I think it works so beautifully. The reason I acquired this was I was picturing this woman making her quilt from her dress scraps, and had a little bit more of the red and the stripes, so she used that for her borders. But she couldn't get to town, or she didn't have the yardage for the back. And so, being frugal, she got the cornmeal sacks down. And the back says, I have it written down, 2 bushels choice water ground Virginia cornmeal, manufactured by R.C. Scott and Company, Lynchburg, Virginia, Fulton Bag and Cotton Mills, Atlanta, Virginia. And so she got her back. Now, I haven't had it tested, but I also picture her boiling those in walnuts or something like that to try to get it brown. But anyway, I love that one because that really is frugality. Now, I tend to like those browns that I showed you earlier. These brown pieces really speak to me. I wear them half the time. But there aren't very many of those around in Nebraska anymore, and here's one of the reasons why. First of all, quilts went through a time when people didn't think they were healthy. In 1876, Peterson's magazine, which was a popular magazine for women, even in Nebraska, they would get Peterson's. It said this: blankets and bed comforters where persons are still unwise enough to use the quilts and comforters instead of the more healthful blankets should be sent to the wash tubs at once. They need the purification of soap, water, and sunlight. Well, what kind of soap were they using in 1876? Lye soap. And has anybody here ever done with fabric what I've done with fabric with lye soap? My mother used to make lye soap, and it was the best, stain remover. It also would eat a hole in the fabric if you didn't know how to use it. But so no wonder. And then I love this one, the Universal Household Assistant from about the same era. Comfortables, which they often called quilts. To renovate. After washing and thoroughly drying bed quilts, fold and roll them tight, then give them a beating with the rolling pin to liven up the batting and make them soft and new. So if they weren't eaten with lye soap, they were beat to death. It's amazing we have any quilts left to look at from our foremothers. Another thing that quilts say to me when I look at them is the women's determination to make beauty with whatever was at hand, and to have a positive attitude about the challenges that they had. Now, when you think about it, there is something a little seriously mentally strange about having a big piece of fabric, cutting it into little tiny pieces, and sewing them all back together again. But we're not going to go there today. We all know we're a little nuts. But in reading about women's history, a lot of my pioneer women end up in sod houses and things like that, and I came across some wonderful quotes. I found it was not necessary to happiness that a house have a floor, or any door, or a window, or even a roof. When I look back on those early struggles, I regard them as the happiest day of my life. I was happy as I could be, even in my little dugout. And this one is great. People, like cabbages, improve by transplanting. Those are the women that I love to read about. I love to find those little anecdotes in histories, and I love to write about those women. This piece I bought unquilted and probably represents a sad time in a woman's life. The only reason I can think of that a crib quilt this beautiful would not have been finished is that maybe the baby died. I got out this piece when my husband was going through chemotherapy. His chemotherapy required the kind of chemo where he had to sit in a chair for hours and have a drip, and I didn't want him to do that alone. And so I got this piece out and decided I would quilt it. Well, remember when I told you people assume you're a nice person if you're a quilter? We had more fun in the chemotherapy room because I would pull out the quilt and sit and stitch, and it would open people up, and we would talk and visit. The other thing that this quilt did for me personally was it was a reminder, a tactile reminder in my lap. You are not the only person who has ever gone through a tough time. You are not the only human being who has ever faced maybe saying goodbye to somebody that you love. And so when I look at that quilt, I actually bought it at first because I thought it was the ugliest color of green I had ever seen. It's almost one of my favorite colors of green now. But that quilt says to me, struggling through a tough time and yet overcoming and making it. Those are the women that I choose to write about. I have a great quote from a woman who homesteaded in Iowa. And she had a very unhappy life. She writes in her diary about blocking the stairs in her home at night with a chair so that when her husband came home and tried to get up the stairs to beat her, she would hear him because he'd stumble on the stairs. So this woman had a really tough life, and yet she writes this: "Finished my sofa cushion cover. 'Tis indeed beautiful. There are 96,256 stitches on it." Now, from the time frame when the diary was being written, I think probably she was working on a crazy quilt. And we have a beautiful one upstairs in the exhibit, so I'm not going to open this completely out, but all those wonderful embroidery stitches. And this woman was a hoot. She's a born mathematician. She knew how many stitches she embroidered an hour, how long it would take her to make it, if she paid herself X number of dollars, how much it would be worth, and she kept those kinds of records with the chickens too. She knew exactly how much money she contributed to her family income. Very fascinating woman, in a diary that you might want to read. It's her name is Emily Hawley, I believe it is, Gillespie, and her book is in print and very interesting to read. Not all the baby stories are sad ones that come from Nebraska history, and I came across a couple that make me laugh, and I want to share those with you. A Kansas midwife is writing of her experience during an unexpected Indian attack. And this is what she says: "Mr. Schmerhorn stood with his gun loaded at a 4-paned window facing toward the besieged blockhouse. I have never been able to recall any incidences of the 2 hours before the troops came, except when the child came, I tore a strip from the string of the white apron I wore, tied the cord, and cut it with a Bowie knife. When the troops came like the wind from the direction of Fort Harker, the Indians fled. The tension being over, I fainted away, there being nothing further for me to do." I relate. I'm the one who's great in a crisis, but later, you'll find me in a corner doing my cry. But I just howled with laughter when I read that. Now, here's another one that every time I do this talk, I read it, hoping that somebody someday will research this and tell me if it's true, because if it's true, the McConaughey's were not the first. This is from the Dakota City Herald, September 3rd, 1889. On the 2nd of August, Mrs. Timothy Bradley gave birth to 8 children, 3 boys and 5 girls. They are all living and are healthy, but quite small. Mr. Bradley's family is increasing fast. He was married 6 years ago to Miss Eunice Lowry, who weighed 273 pounds on the day of their marriage. Now, I stopped there and thought, oh, that's good. Wouldn't we all just love to have our weight published in the paper on our wedding day? And then it ends. She has given birth to 2 pairs of twins, and now 8 more, making 12 children in 6 years. So if I could find a picture of her, I would frame it, put it up, and title it, I Am Woman, I Am Tired. Sometimes I look at old quilts and I think about the pastimes and the fun that the women had who were making them. We know about the habit of making a charm quilt, where you have a quilt that no 2 pieces match. And we know from folklore that women wrote back and forth and traded pieces of fabric. They also did it in the Victorian era with buttons. They would collect buttons, put them on charm strings, and I used that idea in one of my books called Nora's Ribbon of Memories, where Nora's a milliner and she's collecting buttons. And so I had more fun going to button shows and looking at old buttons, and then I would use a different kind of button for each chapter, and in the chapter I told why Nora had saved that button and why it was important to her. I only have one charm quilt, and it's from the turn of the century, and I have quilted it. It was my husband Bob's favorite top that I had, and so I quilted it. But this one, as far as I know, doesn't have any repeats. Every time I think I've found one in a plaid or whatever, I put the 2 together and they don't match. So I do think that this is a charm quilt. I love the folklore that went around with the button charm strings in those days. You were supposed to get 999 buttons, and if you got the 1,000th, it depended on where you lived, what the result would be. Either the man who gave you the 1,000th button would be your husband, or if you put on the 1,000th button, you'd be an old maid. And I like the first one better, but I thought that was fun. Sometimes we think about milestone markers when we make quilts. Probably some of you are working hard to get a baby quilt made for a grandchild, or a graduation quilt for a child, or a wedding quilt for them, or things like that. And we know that some quilts were made for those milestone markers. I have one quilt that I think may have been a wedding quilt, and I'm going to open it out and then I'll walk back over here and tell you why. And it's this album quilt. Can you hear me if I keep talking? With the people from the International Quilt Study Center here, I told Carolyn earlier I should say no quilts were harmed for this talk. Because I don't have white gloves on, and I'm putting it out there, and I'm going to tell you, you can come up and play with them later if you want to, and it's pretty horrifying when you're in a museum to tell people that. But these aren't museum pieces. They're just loved things that live at my house. This may be a Lincoln quilt. I was told when I bought it that it was a Lincoln quilt. I have only been able to find one name in any of the archives in the little bit of research I'm doing, but it's the name of a woman who was married in Lancaster County in 1886. And so if this was Viola's wedding quilt, my story about it, because I can't find any of the other names, is that maybe the people back home made the album blocks and signed them and sent them to her, and she had the quilt made here for her wedding day. The reason I think it was an important quilt, maybe not a wedding quilt, but an important quilt, is it dates from the latter part of the 19th century, which would have been when Lincoln was quite young, and yet you can still see the pencil markings from the way it was quilted. So I don't think it's ever been washed. So whoever owned that, it was very important to them. So I say that's my wedding quilt. And I have a fun wedding story to tell you. You know, the mail order bride thing is always so popular in historical fiction. Luna Kelly was a woman who homesteaded near Hastings, Nebraska. And her husband came on ahead, as they often did, and when he felt that it was okay for her to come home, to come out and live with him, she and a child got on the train and came west on the train. It was later in the 19th century, and the trains were here by then. And Luna is writing about someone who was on the train with her. Now, someday you will read a Stephanie Grace Whitson novel that starts like this. You know, some of the things I find I could never write in a book because nobody would believe them. You know, I couldn't write a fiction story about that because nobody would believe it. But anyway, this is great. This is not about Luna. This is her telling about somebody else who was in the same train car with her. She had hardly got seated when a man above middle age went over by her and went to talking, very sweet and earnest. I saw she did not like what he said, and soon she came back almost in tears and very angry. The old fool asked me to marry him. She said he told her he had a homestead near Kearney and a house and how many horses and cows, and he could not farm and cook, so he needed a wife. He was a widower and was sure she would suit. Well, by the time she was feeling a little better, he was talking earnestly to another young woman, and soon to another, a little older. But he was sure persevering. And soon he came and sat by the old maid, and she puts in parentheses, over 40, and told her all his story, and she smiled very sweetly, smutty face and all, and soon took her valise and went to the toilet room and stayed quite a while, then came out with a clean waist, which would be a blouse, and fresh curls, etc., and went to her seat. He put his arm along the back, and she put her head on his shoulder, and they both looked as if perfectly happy. Now, don't you want to know the rest of that story? I get to make one up and write it in a book, but I loved that. Another thing about this quilt, I've wondered if it's a Lincoln quilt. I came across an anecdote about Judge Roscoe Pound, who when he early on came to Lincoln, it was still called Lancaster, and he operated a dry goods store. And a woman came into the dry goods store and was upset with Judge Pound. He wasn't Judge Pound yet, but was upset with the storekeeper because all the fabric was priced the same. And of course the quality varied greatly, and when she asked him about it, he said, "Oh, I had quite a number of prices, some 15 cents a yard, some 25, but I could not remember which was which. So I just sell it all at 20 cents. That's fair, isn't it?" You could tell he never sewed. No, that's not fair. If we buy 25-cent yard fabric, we want 25-cent yard quality. But anyway. Another mile marker that sometimes is marked by a quilt is a birthday. And I have a lovely embroidered quilt, and many of you here today probably have quilts like this at home. This is the kind of quilt that my mother made. This is a summer spread, and it's on loan from a friend of mine. And it was presented to a woman who belonged to the Maywood, Nebraska Social Club in 1927 for her birthday. And the ladies in the group embroidered blocks, and then they put it together. This is interesting in the way that it's finished. It doesn't have a back on it, but the raw edges have been covered with strips and embroidered so that it won't ravel out. And I thought that was interesting. This piece actually will go home soon to a family member who we finally found who wants it, and that's great. But I want to name a book the Maywood Social Club. I think that's such a great name for a book, but I don't think I dare do it because all those gals will think I'm talking about them. So. Sometimes quilts are made to say something, to give a message about something. We have a quilt upstairs in the exhibit right now that is a political quilt, and it was raffled off and raised money for the Populist Party, which was an ag-related party back in the late 1800s, I think it is. I haven't studied the Populist Party very much. I have a quilt that I made personally that no quilt makers are allowed to look at because the technique is awful. But when my kids were growing up, I wanted to say something about our Christian upbringing and our Christian faith. And so we made a quilt with their favorite Bible stories. And this was in the days before primitive applique was popular, but primitive was the only kind of applique I could do. So a girlfriend who used to be a school teacher drew for us, and the kids would be playing outside. I lived in the country then, and we'd make up a block, and we'd run out, and if they could guess the story, we'd figure we had a keeper. And so these are some of my kids' favorite Bible stories. It's a fun memory for me because when I put this together hodgepodge, I needed a filler for right here. And I decided to do something from Baptist Sunday School. When I grew up as a little kid, they used to give us this thing they called the wordless book. And it was just a bunch of pieces of construction paper put together, different colors, and then we would have to memorize Bible verses to go with those. And so they told us that the black was our sin, and they had a Bible verse for that, and that the red was Jesus' blood, and the white was that Jesus' blood would wash our sin white as snow, and that we were supposed to keep growing in our faith, and someday we would walk on streets of gold. So I liked putting that symbolism in here, and there's other symbolism in it and other stories that go with it. But sometimes we look at quilts and we see they have a Bible name for the block, like there's a Crown of Thorns quilt, or there's King David's this, or Solomon's Temple that. And I often wonder, did those women, were they putting a message in there, or they just liked the block, and that's what it was called. And we all love to look at the quilts that we know that the real reason the women made them was they just wanted to show off. Don't you all have those friends? You can just hardly be in the group with them because they just show off. We had a wonderful speaker at the Lincoln Quilters Guild one year, and she had a talk that she did that was just a hoot on whatever your favorite color was, told what kind of quilter you are. And she said that if your favorite color is red, you are the kind of quilter that if you can't see it from the back of a galloping horse, it'll quilt out. And everybody in Guild who knew me turned around and looked at me when she said that. But that's okay, I still like them, sort of, most of the time. I wrote a couple of stories about a couple of the quilts that I have to conclude with that are, I think, show-off quilts. My story about this one is, I bought this in North Carolina. She liked to quilt, and I love, the part of quilting I like is the hand quilting part. This is beautifully quilted, but I don't think she liked to applique, because the applique that's done isn't really all that good. Some of it's by hand, some of it's by machine. So my story for this one is she got her sewing machine in the middle of making this. And she said, I know how to finish that. And so she appliqued the rest with her machine. We have a wonderful picture over at the International Quilt Study Center of a woman sitting at her treadle sewing machine outside a farmhouse. And she has rigged up a frame that looks to me a lot like the contraption that John Flynn invented and sells. But this is from 18 whenever, or 1920 maybe, and she's machine quilting on her treadle sewing machine outside her farmhouse. And it's a great picture. I have a reference to an 1867 letter where a woman says, "Didn't this sewing machine help me long fast? I never mean to sew by hand anymore if I can help it." In 1866, there was a woman who lived near Lincoln, and she says, "I had the first sewing machine on the creek and had to do lots for neighbors who thought it a great treat to have a machine-made dress. At one time in June, I had 11 dresses to be made before the 4th of July." And I used some of those anecdotes in my book, Karin's Memory Box. Karin is a German from Russia, and her husband Michael buys her a sewing machine, knowing that the women in the area will come to Karin to either borrow her machine or to hire her to sew for them, and it's his way of making her learn to speak English, because she'll have to learn to communicate with her neighbors, and so he uses the sewing machine that way. The woman in Iowa that I told you about who was making the crazy quilt also got a sewing machine and was thrilled. In her diary she says, "I finished Henry's clothes. Took me just 49 hours to make coat, pants, and vest." She was thrilled that her sewing machine helped her make things so quickly. Another anecdote that I came across, and I'm going to have to look for the reference because I want to know if this man survived the comment. He said that he thought that $20 was an awful lot of money for a machine that does a little more than lighten a woman's workload. And I do have one of my husbands say that in my book, Heart of the Sandhills, and he does survive it, but not until he spent a night on the kitchen table, because they don't have room for another bed in the house. So sometimes I think they were just showing off that they had a sewing machine. Sometimes I think they were showing off their skill. The Target quilt that's upstairs in the exhibit right now I don't know. Carolyn, have they ever counted how many pieces of fabric there are? You know, they went through that thing where Mrs. Snyder put 80-some thousand little tiny triangles in her quilt, and somebody over in another state went, "Well, I bet I can make one with 130,000 pieces." I don't understand that mentality, but it got to be kind of that way. So I think sometimes just showing off. I think this woman was showing off her skill with her sewing machine. This quilt is from New York, and the family folklore that came with it is that she spent years making it with a hand crank sewing machine, which I really can't quite figure out, except if you look at the way it's made, I think it's quilt as you go. So Georgia Bonestill maybe found one. You know, nothing's new under the sun, but it amazed me. I thought she invented that. And what's really interesting to me about this technique is I have another quilt from Missouri that's made exactly the same way. And so they were talking to each other somehow. We just haven't been able to find out the documentation of how. But if you come up later and look at this, the quilting lines are only probably maybe 3/8 of an inch to maybe 1/2 an inch apart. You know, so the idea that the sewing machine was great because it made it faster isn't always why women like to use the sewing machine. You know, sometimes they're just that artistic thing. When it all comes down to it, I guess my favorite thing about quilts is that they are definitely symbols of resourcefulness and hard work. And one thing that I have learned studying women's history is I don't want to go back and live it. I like to read about it. I like to imagine what it might have been like. I like to give my characters happy endings. But I really, really agree with a friend of mine who said that if it had been up to her to settle the American West, we'd all still be in Boston drinking tea. And that's probably where I am too. If I would have stepped out of the wagon and been taken to the middle of the sandhills, I probably would have done whatever it took to go back home. So I really admire these women. One of the women in early Lincoln realized that we were losing our pioneer stories, and she collected women's stories, and that's where a lot of what I've shared with you today has come from. It's on microfilm over at the archives. And I like to close with this one. A woman on Plum Creek in Nebraska Territory started a store across from a Pony Express station. She baked as many as 100 pounds of flour a day, sold bread at 50 cents a loaf, and made as much as $30 per day. Now that's a lot of money for Nebraska Territory time. I wouldn't mind making $30 a day most days. She made cheese, which she sold at 25 cents a pound, and travelers paid as much as $2 for the good meals that she prepared. I cannot imagine bearing that kind of a workload, and yet that resourcefulness and that hard work. I have a wool quilt from Palmyra, Nebraska that is probably made from suit findings from the ends of wool sewing projects, and I wish it could talk to me. It isn't finished, and it has a date on it of January 1926, I think it is, and all kinds of symbols embroidered on it, and it's one that I really wish could talk to me and tell me why. But isn't that wonderful and graphic? It's never had a back put on it. I don't know. This is one of those that I kind of just got because I would give it a good home. And it could live at my house. We need to quit because I need to give you time for questions, but I have one more that I'm going to show you. Of all the quilts in my personal collection, and by the way, I quit collecting because I get to play with all the quilts at the International Quilt Study Center, and then I got to play with the quilts here, so I get to play with enough quilts that I don't have to own them anymore. I kind of sort of own them anyway because I'm a citizen, and so do you, and isn't that great? But this one I rescued from being cut up and made into pillows. Thank God the lady changed her mind and decided she didn't get it. Now, the quilters hopefully will get it. That's why I bought it. It made me laugh. Now, she tried to make it square. There is no hope. There is no hope this thing is ever. I had to actually baste it to the sheet just to try to get it so that I could carry it around with me and make people laugh. Now, I am going to write a story about this lady someday, but I wish it could talk to me. My story about her right now is that she was in a home. And as long as they handed her fabric, she was happy. And my kids tell me that's what they'll probably do with me someday, is put me in a home and hand me fabric. So thank you for coming. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have questions, I'll be happy to talk. I don't have a lot of true knowledge about what I do, but I love it. And if you have questions, we certainly have people here who can answer them if I can't. And I promise I won't make anything up unless I tell you. Questions from anybody? Thank you. Anybody have a question they would like to ask? Yes?
I'm from out of state. Tell me just a little bit about the International Quilt.
Okay, I was told to repeat the questions for the TV. So she's from out of state, and she wants to know a little bit about the International Quilt Study Center. Carolyn.
The International Quilt Study Center is located here on the university campus. We're over at East Campus. We house the largest publicly owned collection in the world here in Nebraska. We've been here since 1997. We do numerous exhibits here in the state. Always have something here in Lincoln or on campus that you can see of our collection, and you can certainly visit us over at East Campus as well. We also have the only academic program that offers a master's degree in textile history with an emphasis in quilt studies that you can find in the world. We offer classes locally, we offer classes online, and we offer summer classes that are just 3 and 4 days, and those are available for graduate students, but also for individuals who are just interested in learning more about quilts. The website address is on the Patchwork Lives pamphlet or brochure, and all of our information is there about the many collections that we have and the fabulous collection we have, all of our academic programs, and how to find us and visit us.
Yes.
Tell us about the hexagons, octagons.
I didn't tell you about the hexagons hanging down there. I like that because it's probably dress scraps. I have just acquired that and haven't looked at it very carefully. I think she was making a charm quilt. There was one square attached to the edge with a needle that hadn't been sewn yet. But for my writing, it's wonderful to get things like that are from the 19th century because it helps me know that this is fabric that probably would have been in a dress. And I'm really fascinated by the charm quilts, where they took a triangle or a hexagon or that scallop shape earlier and put that all. They really, for some reason, interest me. So it's just a piece that I picked up just for whatever. It is hand done, yeah. And really, really falling apart fragile. I usually don't take it out, but I wasn't traveling far today, so I brought it with me. Anything else? Yes, ma'am.
Do you know if there were any specific types of quilts that were being made, like broken dishes or whatever, in the 1800s in Nebraska itself?
Specific types of quilts that would be linked to Nebraska from the 1800s?
Well, just the women seem to be making on a consistent basis.
On a consistent basis? I'm not personally aware of any of that. Does anybody here know, has research been done to look into that, whether there were any patterns that were consistent? No.
I think by that time, quilts were so popular and people were making all kinds of styles. I don't know that there were really regional styles that we would have found specific to our state.
There might not have been regional styles by then because quilt making was so well known and they traded notes so much. And I don't think anybody's identifying. The first place to look for that would probably be with some of the ethnic communities to see if there was something that was like ethnically related to the Mennonite group that lived around Henderson or whatever, but I don't think that's ever been looked into. Be a good research topic. Anything else? Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned that some women's stories have been collected into
Women's stories that have been collected. One of the ones I enjoy reading the most is called Covered Wagon Women. I think they're up to 12 volumes, and I don't know if they're finished. Our Bison Press actually has republished those, and what Covered Wagon Women is it is the actual diaries and letters that women who crossed the Oregon Trail, it's the documents that they kept have been transcribed and printed. Those are invaluable to people like me because it's not somebody else saying this is what they saw or this is how they felt. It's in their own words. Often there'll be a county that will collect histories. Custer County did a series in the 1920s where they asked the pioneers to tell their stories, and they published those in their newspaper, and those have been put in a little book. They can be a little bit trickier to find, but often if you travel and you go to the county museums, sometimes you'll find those. Saline County in Lincoln, or in Nebraska, did a history where the pioneers just told their stories. But the Covered Wagon Women is the biggest one that I know of that's available. Yes? They have it in the bookstore. Right out there to the right. Was there a hand? Yes.
Can you tell me the complete title of Aunt Jane's book?
The complete title, I believe it's just Aunt Jane of Kentucky. Is that right? Aunt Jane of Kentucky, and it's by a woman named Calvert, C-A-L-V-E-R-T. It's really a fun read. She takes no baloney from anybody. She even tells the deacon off at one point in the story. It's great. She just, what a character. It's fiction, obviously, but she's really fun. Anything else? I think we're finished. Thank you for coming.